Thank you, Armstrong, for talking about this, because this again is just like the issue we've been talking about, is one that doesn't get much attention on the mainstream media or even here in Washington, which is why I introduced this legislation. And for those who aren't familiar, House Resolution 1175 is a resolution that calls for charges against Julian Assange to be dropped, to drop the indictment that the United States government is currently pursuing, for one very simple reason: our constitutional right to freedom of speech and freedom of the press. If people remember back when Julian Assange, well, let's go back a little bit. Under the Obama administration, there was some consideration about whether or not to indict Assange under that administration. And ultimately, I'm glad they came to that conclusion, the right conclusion, which was a prosecution of Julian Assange would set a very dangerous precedence for other prosecution of members of the press, news media platforms. And unfortunately, under this administration, they have pursued this indictment and are currently trying to bring Julian Assange to the United States, extradite him to the United States to prosecute him under the Espionage Act. And this is where, you know, we should all as Americans be concerned about freedom. We talk about freedom, sometimes it's thrown around very lightly, as though it's something that exists no matter what. Yes, our freedoms are guaranteed in the Constitution, but we cannot take them for granted, because it is things like this and examples like this that seek to erode those freedoms. And the deafening silence that we hear from most politicians is dangerous, but it's also very telling that for whatever reason, they're choosing not to co-sponsor this resolution, or the resolution I introduced to drop charges against Edward Snowden for the heroic action that he took to expose lies within our government and expose the reality that our government has been spying, collecting information and spying on every single American without a warrant, this mass surveillance program. Politicians here are not talking about the legislation that I've introduced to reform the Espionage Act, which as it stands right now, if one is charged with national security concerns under the Espionage Act, as Snowden and Julian Assange have been, if you go to court, you don't have a fair day in court, because the law as it stands currently does not allow you as the defendant to speak to why you did what you did, to speak to your intent, to speak to what you were hoping to accomplish by releasing this classified information, for example. And so, you know, this is something that this is a problem that's been in place for a very long time. We saw, I think, among the highest numbers of individuals charged under the Espionage Act under the Obama administration. We are seeing now, again, individuals being charged and indicted under the Espionage Act, which speaks to why that needs to be reformed. Even Edward Snowden talked about how he would come back to the United States and face his charges if he knew he would have a fair day in court. But the Espionage Act, as it stands currently, does not allow for that. All of this is to say, why is it that Democrats and Republicans, the leadership, are not taking a stand for freedom, and how dangerous it is when you only speak out and defend freedom when you feel like it is your own freedoms under attack, but are silent when it is someone else who is suffering or being impacted by it, being very short-sighted not to see that this may be impacting that person today, but it could be you tomorrow.
Or somebody you love.
Or somebody that you love and that you care about. Exactly. And this is where I felt so strongly that this legislation had to be introduced to bring this issue to the forefront. Obviously, urging congressional leaders to pass it, but also just to hold them accountable. So that every one of you who's watching this, that you can call your representative or senator, email them, say, hey, have you co-sponsored this? If not, why not? You don't care about freedom? I mean, what's the issue here? What's the problem?
Right.
And that accountability, I think, is so necessary, and it's easy for members of Congress to skate by and tell you, oh, well, I didn't know about it, or I'm not aware of the issue, if there's not a piece of legislation that they have to make a decision about whether or not they'll add their name to.
Thank you for sharing the information about your resolution. And again, for those of you who want to look up the resolution, it's House Resolution 1175. I know that, you know, people understand the Bill of Rights and what the First Amendment, but just to remind, I mean, the framers, imperfect, I always put that qualifier there because that's a whole nother lecture.
Mm-hmm.
They put freedom of the press in there for a reason.
Right. It's that counterbalance. It's that
right.
check and balance to our government.
Sure.
That we must have. And look, you know, I mean, how many times you open the New York Times, the Washington Post, and you see leaked classified information coming from an anonymous source within the intelligence community or the Department of Defense. This kind of thing happens all the time. And so if you see an example like this, where our government is very selectively choosing to prosecute certain individuals, but not other media sources, you know, and those media sources not standing up and really speaking out, recognizing that this is a threat to our, not only our known media, like, you know, the big ones,
Mm-hmm.
but in this internet age, look, you and I, if we publish a blog, or, you know, this conversation we're having right now, we could be considered as members of the media in some fashion, right? Every individual now has the power to become a voice in sharing information with the public.
That's right.
And so this threat that exists through the prosecution of Assange and Snowden and others is not one that is isolated just for people like them. This is something that is frankly a threat to every reporter, every member of the media, and every American.
Indeed. I mean, it reminds me, I know Reverend Dr. King wasn't talking about this issue in particular when I put this quote out here, but the whole notion of what affects one directly affects us all indirectly. And that's in every single aspect of our lives. And so, again, just bringing you information, getting you to try to think about these issues in a different way. Could be you, could be somebody that you love. And this is not about whether or not you believe, I mean, my take on this is not whether or not let me use myself, I believe whether or not what these individuals did was right, but it's about fairness. Yeah. And so under the espionage, right, if they
I'm
can't.
glad you said that, because that's, you know, exactly what they did or how they did it is not really the point here. The point here is about fairness in a judicial system.
Right.
And it is about protecting freedom.
Exactly. That's it. And we can debate whether it was right or wrong, but that person or those persons should be able to have a fair hearing, if you will, a fair accounting, if you will. That's really what we're talking about. And that's really what we want you all to think about.